Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell, and in this slideshow, we're going to look at some of the people who influenced Darwin's ideas about change over time in living things. And we're going to start with the very first person on our list, which is a guy who was a famous geologist. His name was James Hutton. And notice the dates in this. This is 1785. This is before Darwin's time now. So his ideas had been published when Darwin was alive, and so he was aware of Hutton's ideas about geology, and he studied the earth and rocks and things that were happening on the planet. And he proposed that the earth was shaped by geological forces that happened over long periods of time. We're talking very long periods of time, that the earth is really millions of years old. And he was one of the first people to actually propose that idea that the earth is much, much, much older than was previously thought at the time. And when he's talking about geological forces, he's talking about things that you can see that shape the surface of our planet, things like erosion, volcanic activity. We have forces that are happening as part of nature that cause changes to the geological features of our planet. Mountains are forming, earthquakes happen, things are moving. And Hutton was the guy who said that these forces are happening, and over long periods of time. The earth has been shaped for millions and millions of years. The next person that shaped Darwin's thinking was a man named Charles Lyell. He also was a geologist, a rock guy, and he's kind of built on Hutton's idea about the earth being really, really old, and the idea that geology was changing, that the face of the earth, ecosystems were changing. And what Lyell said was that those processes that shaped the earth, the erosion, the volcanic activity, things moving, plates moving, they didn't really know about plate tectonics at the time, since that's an idea that is a more recent idea. But they understood that these forces were changing the surface of our planet. And what Lyell said is they didn't just happen millions of years ago. They're still going on. They're happening now. We still have volcanoes erupting and erosion happening and rivers changing course. And all of these things that have been going on for millions of years, he said, those are still happening now. Lyell was actually alive at the time of Charles Darwin. He was a friend of the captain on the Beagle, Captain Fitzroy, and so Darwin knew about Lyell and his ideas. He learned about him from Captain Fitzroy and from the books that he had on the Beagle. Remember, we said at that time there's not a lot of things to do. No electronics, no cell phones, no watching Netflix at night for entertainment. And reading was one of the things that they did, that Darwin did on the boat to take up time. And one of the books he had on the boat that he was reading about was Charles Lyell's book about geology, and it included some of those things that Hutton had said earlier about the earth being very old and all those processes that were happening to shape the earth. And if you think about that idea of change over time, if you are thinking that the earth is changing, it kind of played into Darwin's idea about if the earth is changing and the planet, the surface of the planet is changing, things are happening to the ecosystem, to the planet, why wouldn't living things change as well? If you think about tying that to local, what we know about South Dakota, at one time we had a very different climate here. Some of the fossilized plants and things that we find in South Dakota. South Dakota is a big fossil hunting state, lots of fossils. If you've ever been West River out to the dinosaur digs, a mammoth site that's out by Rapid City. Lots of dinosaur hunters and fossil hunters come to South Dakota to look for fossils. And long time ago, South Dakota had a very different climate, more of a lot warmer than we are today. And we can tell that by looking at the organisms that we find in the fossil record. So we know that the Earth is changing. We know places now that don't have water. We find things like seashells in those places. So we know the surface of the planet has changed. And Darwin was aware of that idea of changing surface of our planet. And it kind of led him to think about what would happen to organisms that lived in those places as they changed. We now know a little bit more about the idea of plate tectonics and how volcanic activity forms new Earth and shapes changes on the planet. We have plates, the continental plates, crashing into each other and moving, forming mountains, moving around. The idea of Pangea and continental drift. If we look at the planet and the shapes of the continents now, if you kind of put them together like a jigsaw puzzle, scientists actually have evidence that should suggest that all of the continents were together as one giant landmass at one time when the Earth was very young, and have since drifted apart. That idea of continental drift moved into the positions that they are, and they're still moving today. We have evidence of that, and we can measure how the continents are moving. They're still moving around on the planet. They're floating on magma underneath the surface, and the continents are still moving today. The Earth is still changing. And Darwin didn't know about that idea of continental drift or Pangea, but nowadays even more evidence for the idea of changing Earth and therefore changing organisms that live on the planet. If you remember back to our chapter 3 on ecosystems, we talked about the idea of competition and living things competing for food, for shelter, for space to live, for mates. And that idea kind of ties into another gentleman who influenced Darwin, and his name is Thomas Malthus. Notice the dates on this now. He was born in the late 1700s, so he's a little bit older than Darwin. And Malthus wasn't a scientist. He actually worked in the census office, and you know that in the United States every 10 years we take a census and people fill out forms and tell about themselves and where they're living and how many in your family and information about that that's collected by our government, and other governments do that too. And back at that time, Malthus worked in the census office collecting data, collecting information about populations, and he wrote a paper suggesting that because there were more babies being born, babies were being born faster than we had deaths happening in the population, that populations were growing. And he suggested that if the human population continued to grow at the pace it was growing, sooner or later there's not going to be enough food or space for everybody. And he put that idea out there. Darwin was aware of it, and tied into what Darwin knew about ecosystems and organisms as he observed as he was traveling around on his journey on the Beagle. The idea that there's competition between organisms and ecosystems, and even more so than the human population, because we have organisms that produce many, many, many offspring, way more offspring than are able to survive for the food that's available. And Darwin kind of saw that idea of competition tied into his ideas about who's going to survive and who's not going to be able to survive. Remember, we played that bear game where we talked about you guys competed for food tokens and how many bears can live in the woods. We looked at what happens in populations if there's not enough food to go around, and kind of led to Darwin's idea about survival of organisms and who's going to survive in an ecosystem and who's not. The other person who was an influence on Darwin was this man. His name is JeanBaptiste Lamarque. He was French. Notice the date on this, 1809. He was actually one of the first people to recognize that living things do change over time, and that species are related to each other, that new species are descended from ancestor species. And he actually published a hypothesis. Remember, we talked about hypotheses are educated guesses, what he thought was happening, this idea of living things changing over time. And he called it inheritance of acquired traits. And he actually published his idea about inheritance of acquired traits the year that Darwin was born. So Darwin also was aware of Lamarck's ideas and the idea of change over time in living things. Darwin kind of accepted all of Lamarck's ideas and kind of built on those. Later on, we would find out that maybe some of Lamarck's ideas weren't exactly how things worked. But Darwin was definitely aware of this idea of change over time, and Lamarck's idea about inheritance of acquired traits. So let's talk a little bit about what his hypothesis was. What Lamarck said was that organisms could acquire traits in their lifetime that could be inherited by their offspring. So for example, if I'm a crab, a male crab, and male crabs use their front claws to defend themselves, to attract mates, fight off predators. And what Lamarck said was that if you have an organism that has a body part, for example, that's being used a lot, it's going to grow bigger. And those changes are going to happen in the organism. It's an acquired trait. That means it didn't have it when it was born, but something, the organism is doing something, exercise to make the part grow bigger, or the opposite could be true. If you have body parts that you're not using, that they would shrink smaller and kind of become useless, unable to function, and that these characteristics that you acquire in your lifetime through use, repeated use, could be passed on to your offspring. So if Lamarck was right, this idea of inheriting acquired traits, that this little male crab, as he repeatedly used that claw and it grew bigger through exercise and using it to defend himself, to attract mates, his claw would grow larger, and then when he had offspring, he would pass that acquired trait onto his offspring. They would also be born with large claws that would help them defend themselves and attract mates. So what do you think about that idea? What do you think about the idea that you can acquire a trait in your lifetime and then pass that on to your children? Is that how inheritance works? Because remember, we did a whole chapter about genetics and how traits are inherited. Is it possible to just pick up a trait by exercise or by learning something and then pass that on to your kids? Not really. What's wrong with Lamarck's idea, his hypothesis, is that he didn't really know anything about genes and how traits are inherited. And remember, we had Mendel and we talked about pea experiments, and now we know about genes. But Lamarck at that time, and Darwin too, did not really know about DNA. It hadn't been discovered yet. We didn't know about chromosomes. We didn't know about genetics or genes. And so he kind of had a little wrong idea, a misconception about how traits are passed on. So if you're a bodybuilder, and you may recognize this gentleman, his name is Arnold Schwarzenegger. Before he got to be governor of California, before he got to be an actor, a movie actor in action movies, he was a bodybuilder. He was Mr. Universe, and this is what he looked like at the time. When you lift weights, causes your muscles to get bigger. So if you think about Lamarck's idea about acquired traits, if you lift weights, would your kids be born with big muscles? Probably not. This would be an acquired trait, and acquired traits are not passed on to offspring. This organism, Arnold, acquired the trait by hard work and bodybuilding, lifting weights, but that doesn't mean that those traits are going to be passed on to his children. Example, if you were a piano player and you took piano lessons and became an accomplished pianist, you have the ability to do that. That's an acquired trait for you, but when you have children, that trait is not going to be passed on to your children. They're going to have to acquire the trait for themselves. They're going to have to take piano lessons and practice And if they want to become a good piano player, they're not going to inherit that just because you are a good piano player. And it's because we know now about how inheritance works, and it's the information has to be coded for in your DNA, in your genes, to allow a trait to be passed on. So Lamarck wasn't really right about how the idea of passing traits works, but he was right about a couple things. He was the first person to develop a hypothesis about evolution and to really recognize that organisms change over time and they're adapted to their environment where they live. So what Lamarck would say about this giraffe is that he acquired the trait of having a long neck by reaching continuously for food high up in trees. And slowly over time his neck would stretch longer, and then he would have a longer neck and pass that trait on to offspring. We know now that that's not really how it works, that genetics is going to determine the length of your neck, and that long-necked giraffes, if they have offspring that have long necks, it's because they are inheriting a gene to make them have a long neck. We're going to take a little quiz here, so I'm going to ask you to take a minute, look at these ideas at the bottom, and match the letter of the idea with the man or men who came up with the idea. I'm going to ask you to stop the slideshow, hit the pause button for a minute, and then fill in the blanks above, and then we're going to check our answers in just a second. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to fill in your answers and see what you think. Okay, I think we're back now, and we're going to check and see how you did. So the A choice says the Earth is really old and slowly changes are happening on our planet. The person who said that was Lyell and Hutton. Those two gentlemen together were our geology people, our rock people, and they talked about the Earth, the age of the Earth being very old, talking millions of years old, and that slow changes are happening due to those geological processes, volcanic activity, erosion. Our B choice, living things pass acquired changes onto their offspring. The clue to this is acquired changes. That was Lamarck. He had the inheritance of acquired trait idea, that you could acquire traits in your lifetime and then pass those traits on to the offspring. We kind of know that that's not true now, but that was Lamarck who came up with that idea. C choice, sooner or later, populations are going to run out of resources as populations grow bigger. There's not enough food, there's not enough space for everyone. That idea came from Malthus. And D, living things change slowly over time because of competition for resources and pass those changes on to offspring. That is Darwin. Darwin took information about geology, about populations, competition, and change over time in organisms and combined them into his theory of evolution. We're going to stop right there. Thanks for watching. And next slideshow, we're going to actually look at Darwin's theory and see what it's all about.